At this moment, Benjamin Netanyahu is either in the air, on his way to Washington, or has already landed. His plane left from an Israeli Air Force base Monday night with no journalists aboard, the Israeli press citing unspecified Iranian security threats as the reason for the secrecy. Today, he meets Donald Trump in the Oval Office for the first time since the war with Iran began, 5 months ago. In the same building, the same day, Trump separately meets Volodymyr Zelensky. Two leaders, two active wars. One afternoon, separately, Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of a convicted authoritarian, herself a former corruption defendant, is being sworn in as president of Peru today, continuing a rightward swing across Latin American politics that has now produced a series of leaders their predecessors would have called impossible. And France and Spain are still fighting the wildfires described as monster scale that AFP confirmed yesterday, as more heat rolls in from North Africa toward a continent that has now had 3 major climate emergencies in under 3 months. Let's take all 3. Start with the White House, because what happens there today is the most consequential single afternoon of the Iran war. The relationship between Trump and Netanyahu entering this meeting is documented and specific. Trump called Netanyahu fucking crazy during a heated phone call last month. When Axios reported this, Trump confirmed the account was accurate. When asked Monday on Air Force One whether he and Netanyahu are on the same page about Iran, Trump said, "We have a little difference, but pretty close." CNN's reporting from 3 hours ago confirmed what that little difference actually is. Netanyahu flew to Washington to discuss progress in the Iran war and warned Trump against diplomatic concessions. The CNN story is explicit. Netanyahu's mission is to tell Trump not to make a deal. That framing is the critical one. The bombing pause that began Friday night is, from Netanyahu's perspective, alarming. The U.S. military stopped its 13 consecutive night campaign. Iran stopped retaliating. Trump's UN envoy Mike Waltz told NBC on Sunday that Trump is giving talks some space. The deputy foreign ministers of Iran and Oman began discussions about the Strait of Hormuz. This is, from Trump's perspective, the diplomatic opening he needs. From Netanyahu's perspective, it is the moment at which a war that could permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear capability is being traded away for a deal that, in his assessment, will not. Netanyahu's political calculation is inseparable from this position. He faces Israeli parliamentary elections on October 27, 2026, barely 3 months away. Haaretz confirmed his domestic political situation is dire. Only 33% of Israelis view him as the best candidate to be prime minister, while 59% prefer someone else. He has survived politically in the past by positioning himself as the irreplaceable guardian of Israeli security. The Iran war was his project. It was Netanyahu who made the Situation Room pitch to Trump on February 11th, with what CNN described as predictions that didn't pan out, that led to the February 28 strikes. If that war ends with a deal that leaves Iran's nuclear program intact, or with Iran's ballistic missiles and proxy network unconstrained, Netanyahu loses the central argument of his political survival. If the war continues until Iran's nuclear capability is permanently eliminated, he wins. His political survival and his military preference are perfectly aligned, and they are directly opposed to Trump's. Trump's political calculation runs in the opposite direction. The midterm elections are in November. Brent crude hit $100 a barrel last week. Gas prices are above $4 a gallon in the United States. GOP senators have been publicly telling him the war's economic consequences are generating voter alarm. The House passed a War Powers Resolution 214 to 208, with Republicans breaking ranks. His own Joint Chiefs chair raised concerns about the munitions stockpile at a White House meeting Friday, the same evening the bombing stopped. Trump needs oil prices down, which requires Hormuz open, which requires a deal before November. That calculation produces pressure toward precisely the diplomatic concessions Netanyahu is flying to Washington to resist. Foreign policy summarized the meeting's structural tension plainly. Iran remains the central divide, as Netanyahu pushes for renewed military action while Trump leans toward diplomacy. NBC News confirmed the White House is describing the agenda as covering the Iran conflict, the Lebanon framework, and Abraham Accords expansion. It did not confirm anything about the outcome. There is one more dimension worth noting. Netanyahu's trip to Washington includes attending the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham at Washington National Cathedral. Graham died July 12 at 71. He was, for his entire career, one of the most reliably hawkish voices in Congress on Iran, and one of Netanyahu's most consistent and enthusiastic Senate allies. Netanyahu's presence at Graham's funeral is both a mark of genuine personal relationship and a visible signal about what Graham represented for the U.S.-Israel-Iran strategic framework. The most prominent pro-military pressure senator on Iran died 2 weeks ago. The man whose political survival depends on military pressure on Iran is attending his funeral today. On the same day, he meets the American president who is considering stopping that pressure. The symbolism is not subtle. Al Jazeera's live blog, updated 6 minutes ago, carried the most current read. Iran says U.S. struggling to end 5-month-old war as Netanyahu arrives in Washington, D.C. for talks with Trump. That is Iran's framing of the current moment. It is not the only framing, but it is the one that comes from the country that just watched the bombs stop falling for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and is watching Washington receive a visitor whose explicit mission is to restart them. Trump is also separately meeting Zelensky today at the White House, confirmed by a White House official to NBC News. Ukraine's newly appointed commander-in-chief, General Mihailo Drapati, 43 years old, appointed less than 2 weeks ago, following 6 days of protests in Kyiv, is presumably represented in Zelensky's updated military posture. Trump gave Ukraine a Patriot manufacturing license at the NATO summit. Russia is still advancing in eastern Ukraine. Today's meeting will address what comes next in that war's diplomatic track. 2 leaders, 2 wars, 1 afternoon. Whatever comes out of the White House today will shape the next chapter of both. Now, Peru. Because a country that has been in near-continuous political crisis for years just made a historically significant choice. Keiko Fujimori was sworn in as president of Peru on Tuesday, July 28th. Foreign policy confirmed in its roundup of today's key world events, published yesterday. She is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who governed Peru from 1990 to 2000, was convicted of human rights violations and corruption in 2009, and died in 2023 while still serving his prison sentence. Keiko herself has run for the Peruvian presidency 3 times. She has faced her own legal proceedings, including charges of money laundering related to campaign financing. She was previously jailed pending trial and released. She has now been elected president. Peru's political context makes this outcome both understandable and historically striking. Peru experienced extraordinary political instability. Presidents arrested, impeached, resigned, or forced out in rapid succession. The country experienced a congressional coup attempt, a failed presidential self-coup, mass street protests, and a constitutional crisis that would have exhausted most political systems. Against that backdrop, the Fujimori name, associated with both authoritarian governance and in some Peruvian political memory, a period of economic stabilization and the military defeat of the Shining Path insurgency, offers a specific kind of appeal. Stability, even authoritarian stability, is a compelling promise when the alternative has been chaos. What Keiko Fujimori's election means for Peru's specific policy trajectory is not fully confirmed in available sourcing. What the broader Latin American pattern shows is a continent where the political center has collapsed in multiple countries simultaneously, and where the replacement politics have come predominantly from the right. Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who governs with mega-prison consolidation of power. Javier Milei in Argentina, who has pursued radical economic liberalization. And now Keiko Fujimori in Peru, whose father's presidency included documented massacres and intelligence agency abuses. Whether these 3 represent a coherent ideological movement or simply 3 different expressions of voter frustration with the existing political class is a question political scientists will debate. What is confirmed is the timing. All 3 have come to power in the same regional cycle, and all 3 carry some version of the strong leader, less accountability brand. The specific tension in Peru's case is the Fujimori legacy itself. Alberto Fujimori was convicted by a Peruvian court of specifically authorizing death squad operations. The case law is established. His daughter was not personally convicted. Her legal proceedings ended without conviction, but the name she carries is associated with the most documented human rights violations of any Latin American leader of the post-Cold War era, who was also convicted in his own country's courts. Peru's voters chose that name anyway. That choice tells you something specific about how Peruvians have weighed the alternatives, and it is a choice that deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than either celebrated or condemned from the outside. And now the fires, because they were described as monster yesterday, and the forecast says more heat is coming. AFP's Bordeaux dispatch, confirmed in the Nampa ticker for July 27th, described France and Spain simultaneously battling wildfires of monster scale, with more heat on the way. The EU's civil protection mechanism has been activated, confirmed as part of the standard European response framework for cross-border climate disasters of this scale. I want to situate this in what has already been documented this summer, because the fires are the third wave of a European climate emergency that has been continuous since May. First wave, a European heat wave in late May. 11 confirmed deaths, records broken in 5 countries, infrastructure failures in Germany and Italy from heat loads the systems weren't designed for. Second wave, the late June and early July heat wave, the Omega block that locked a mass of superheated air over the continent with no wind to disperse it. More than 1,300 confirmed excess deaths across Europe, including approximately 1,000 in France alone. Paris approaching 40 degrees Celsius on June days for the first time in recorded history. Healthcare workers noting that the people dying were primarily the elderly, living alone in apartments not built for heat. The WHO Director General confirming that European homes, workplaces, and schools were not built for these temperatures. Third wave, now. Wildfires in France and Spain simultaneously, described as monster scale, in Bordeaux and across the Iberian Peninsula, with more heat coming from North Africa. The scientific record on this pattern is unambiguous. Copernicus confirmed earlier this month that June temperatures in Western Europe were nearly 5.5 degrees Celsius above average. Attribution scientists confirmed that events of this type and frequency would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. The pattern is not a deviation from a stable norm. It is the new norm establishing itself, month by month, event by event, death by death, fire by fire. What changes each time is the number, 11, then 1, 300, and now, fire across 2 countries at the same time, while more heat is forecast. The specific location of today's most reported fires, Bordeaux, is itself significant. Bordeaux is one of the most recognizable wine regions in the world, and one of the most directly climate-exposed agricultural systems in Europe. The vine varieties, the harvest windows, the soil drainage patterns, the characteristic flavors of specific appellations, all of them are calibrated to temperatures and rainfall patterns that are now being disrupted every summer. European viticulture has been quietly rewriting its entire production logic for years in response to changing temperatures, harvesting earlier, moving to higher elevations, planting different varieties. The fires don't care about any of that adaptation. A fire that takes a vineyard doesn't care what variety of grape was growing in it. More heat is on the way. The same atmospheric conditions that produced the June heat waves and now the July fires are forecast to persist or intensify through early August across southern and western Europe. This is not a summer story. It is an infrastructure story, a mortality story, and an agricultural story about a continent whose physical environment is changing faster than its buildings, its healthcare systems, and its farming practices can adapt. 3 stories today, on the Tuesday that the White House is trying to manage 2 wars at once. Netanyahu is meeting Trump to push against the very diplomatic opening that Trump's own political calculations are driving toward, a meeting whose outcome will determine whether the bombing pause becomes a ceasefire or the opening round of a renewed escalation. Keiko Fujimori is being sworn in as Peru's president, adding another chapter to a Latin American political narrative in which voters have repeatedly chosen the promise of authority over the memory of what previous authority actually did. And France and Spain are fighting monster wildfires as more heat comes in, the third major European climate emergency since May. Continuing a summer that has now killed over 1,300 people from heat alone before the fires were added. The White House meeting doesn't have an outcome yet. Fujimori's presidency is just beginning. The fires haven't been contained. All three are in progress, and all three are pointing towards something that won't be fully visible until after today ends. That is the specific discomfort of the news on a day like this. The most consequential things are still being decided.